The year 2020. Wow. It's been a bit of a disaster for all of us, with the possible exception of those people for whom it's been a complete disaster. But what if I were to tell you that in spite of everything, we are blessed and lucky? I invite you to come with me for a change of perspective. My goal is to persuade you that 2020 has not, in fact, been the worst year ever. 2020 has some impressive qualifications as a terrible year. There was the spring, for instance, with the fires, and then the summer with some more fires, and then there isn't time to list them all. Soon, though, I hope that you will be glad that you're alive in 2020 and not in the year 536. Noted medieval historian Michael McCormick has nominated 536 as the worst year to be alive ever, and with some good reasons. The sheer number of disastrous events of 536, their global impact, and their historical impact elevate that year in awfulness above even such awful years as 1349 and 1918. The years 536 and 2020 do have this in common. They both began in what, for the standards of the time, was an ordinary way. Are you familiar with the phrase, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb? You might say that March of 2020 came in like something of a grumpy lion and went out like a lamb that's been eating marijuana flowers. And you could say that March of 536 came in like the opening chapter of The Grapes of Wrath, in which life is difficult but survivable, and went out like the pivotal chapter in a Stephen King novel, in which everything goes really horribly wrong. Now, if you have read some history, you may be forgiven for thinking that Deirdre, bad harvests and subsequent famines happened throughout the first millennium. You're going on about 536 as if it were going to be the triggering event that resulted ultimately in, I don't know, the final collapse of the Roman Empire and the death of a megacity in Mesoamerica and one of the worst pandemics mankind has ever endured. And I would smile at you, a sardonic smile, and say, yes, you're correct on both counts. Because famines were common in the first millennium, that among bad years, 536 was special. It would take almost an hour to properly describe and explain the catastrophe that was the year 536. So instead, I propose to provide a quick compare and contrast between the current awful year and the historical one. For all its faults, 2020 has taken place in a time of volcanic quietude. Yes, we did have Heya Flai Sala Iahuil, the tongue-twisting volcano that exploded in Iceland in 2010. But aside from that, the volcanic explosions have been modest in both number and size. The people of 536 were not so lucky. a volcanic explosion, probably in Indonesia, threw tons of volcanic debris thousands of feet into the air. This volcanic ash was such a fine powder that the slightest breeze could, and did, keep it suspended. Trade winds distributed it throughout the globe, effectively blanketing the whole planet in a dirty tarpaulin of volcanic debris. According to the 6th century historian Procopius, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams that it shed were not clear. End quote. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you've gone for a walk on a brilliant sunny day in the summer. Now imagine that you cross the road from the sunny side of the street over to the shady side. Was one side warmer than the other? Yes, the sunny side will have been warmer because direct sunlight provides more heat than does indirect sunlight. And the same thing is true on a global level. When the blanket of volcanic debris threw shade over the entire globe, it blocked the direct sunlight, thus cooling the lands and the seas. Now, close your eyes again and imagine that you have 2 wet t-shirts. One of them you hang up to dry over a sun-heated patio. The other you hang up to dry from an eave in the shadow of the building. Would you expect one of those t-shirts to dry faster than the other? And if so, which one? Yes, the one suspended over the sun-hot patio is going to dry faster because the moisture in that t-shirt will be being heated by the sun's rays, and warm water evaporates faster than does cool water. Again, the same thing is true on a global level. The sunless skies of 536 inhibited evaporation from the oceans and seas and lakes. This resulted in there being less cloud cover, and this resulted in there being less rainfall, and that caused a global drought. Now, here's another way in which 2020, with all its faults, is superior to 536. And that is that we have the advantage of a robust and diverse economy, which permits much greater income equality than was even possible back in the 6th century. Current estimates suggest that the percentage of global population currently living in extreme poverty is only 12%. For perhaps the first time in history, people living in the middle income category outnumber the percentage of people who live below the global poverty line. By contrast, as recently as the early 19th century, it's estimated that as much as 70% of the global population lived in poverty. Poverty statistics for the 6th century are few and far between, as you can imagine, but it is estimated that the poverty level at that time may have been as much as 90%, if not slightly higher. In the 6th century, the majority of nations had agricultural economies. These economies gave most benefit to a few wealthy landowners, who owned the property on which the agricultural products were produced. In a nation's economy, focus on agricultural products can be a good thing, but a lack of diversity isn't. And where there is widespread crop failure, agricultural economies suffer. Hey, and guess what happens when there's a drought? Yeah, crops fail. Now, I hinted earlier that 536, as well as being a terrible year in its own right, was also the triggering event, or the lit fuse, if you will, leading to an additional 10 years of terribleness. Perhaps I should explain a little more about that. So, mankind survived the year 536, obviously. And in 537 and 538, the weather improved a bit. Just a bit, though, because, as we now know, the volcanic explosion in 536 began the 6th century mini ice age. And in 539 and 540, everything went bad again. Let us turn our attention now to focus on Eurasia, where grain foods made up the staple of just about everyone's diet. Most nations had stores of grain set aside to support the population between harvests and through the occasional bad harvest year. In the mid-6th century, these stores were depleted far faster than they could possibly have been replenished. The grain stores became so depleted that they could no longer support even the population of rats that normally would have lived in any barns or silos. This led a species of flea, which normally would content itself to bite rats, to go looking for an alternative host. The fleas found humans. This was very bad news for the humans. Allow me to introduce Yersinia pestis, better known to us as the bubonic plague. Yersinia is a blood-borne disease which is spread by bites from infected fleas. This method of transmission also proved to be rather bad news for the humans. During this time, Justinian, the Emperor of Rome, had grand ambitions to rebuild the Roman Empire to its former glory. His plans included an extension of commerce throughout the Mediterranean region and into the Middle East. Rome would import raw materials from around the known world. It would expand its manufacturing and mercantile industries and would then export goods throughout the known world. Wealth would pour into the treasuries in Rome, and the empire would regain its former power and influence. And hypothetically, this could have worked, except that international trade at the time was carried out mostly by sailing ships. And sailing ships had food on board to support the sailors. And this food attracted rats, who were then exported to all the places where the ships sailed. Those rats had fleas. And because of the relaxed hygiene standards of the 6th century, The sailors had fleas, and the longshoremen in the ports where the ships landed had fleas, and the merchants who bought things from the importers had fleas, and the customers who bought things from the merchants had fleas. I think you can see where this is going. Here is where 2020 has another huge advantage over 536. Because in the roughly 1500 years between the historical bad year and the current one, we have made great advances in science and understanding. The plague, on the other hand, exploded onto a world that had no nutrition science, no concept of epidemiology, and no organized and effective healthcare systems. The majority of people were poor and overworked. Everyone was malnourished, and everyone lived in unsanitary conditions. Any person of any age or any race or any social status could be struck down by disease. With a famine still underway, and now with a global pandemic wreaking havoc, nations went into lockdown. They closed their ports and borders, refusing all imports. Justinian's ambitious plans could not proceed under those circumstances. And the Roman Empire, already weakened by years of mismanagement and foreign invasion, collapsed completely. In 2020, we live in clean houses. We drink clean water. We bathe regularly. We have plumbing systems that take our bodily wastes out of our living spaces, and we have good soap to wash our hands with. The lives of the global majority in the middle income category are not quite so safe and comfortable as our own, and yet even they have many advantages that were not available to the global majority in the 6th century. For instance, huge advances in public education mean that now even ordinary people know how diseases are spread and what steps we need to take to prevent that from happening. The baseline of global health is higher in the 21st century than it was in the 6th. All but the most destitute and disenfranchised amongst us can more easily resist infection and more readily recover from illness than could our 6th century ancestors. And as awful as COVID-19 admittedly is, the mortality rate of COVID-19 is reckoned to be about 6 to 8% among people reporting serious symptoms, and as little as 0.6% amongst everyone who receives a diagnosis, regardless of symptomology. The mortality rate for the bubonic plague in its first triumphal tour of Europe was about 60%. Oh, and it didn't stop in Europe. No, it made its way to Asia and Africa and pretty much everywhere that people traveled. And here is another huge advantage for 2020, because the bubonic plague is a bacterial illness. In the early part of the 21st century, we can cure it in a couple of days with a few dollars worth of antibiotics. I hope that I've led you to a greater appreciation for 2020. Yes, We have had some unfortunate weather events, but I maintain that the unfortunate weather events of 536 were worse. Did I mention that in the 6th century there were reports of rain the color of blood? No, I left that out. So, did I also fail to mention the reports of a vile gray substance that clung wherever rain had fallen and which smothered plants and choked insects? No? Oh, yes. The lockdowns have caused damage to the economies of many nations. People who normally would support businesses and the businesses who normally would support people are both struggling, and entire communities are suffering as a result of that. Everyone who's been affected by the economic shutdown is fully deserving of support and sympathy. But it may be worth mentioning, though, that right now, whether you are a corporate executive or a cashier at Walmart, your standard of life is higher than the standard of life experienced by a 6th century nobleman. Let that sink in for a moment. The average American in 2020 has a higher standard of life than did the richest and most powerful men of the 6th century. Now, I grant you that the ruling classes of 6th century Byzantium had a much more awesome wardrobe than anything that you currently own. But you have the advantage that you get to choose your own house and your own spouse and your own career. And if you haven't yet reached the half century, you have the benefit of knowing that they probably died before they were 50, and you probably won't. I'll take freedom over amazing clothes, and probably so will you. Even while we as individuals struggle with the fallout from the COVID-19 crisis, we know that scientists in many countries are working to create safe, effective, and affordable treatments for COVID-19 and vaccines to prevent it from spreading. There is every reason to believe that a vaccine could be publicly available by the summer of 2021, if not somewhat sooner. The awful events of 536 left the peoples and nations of the world helplessly facing the prospect that their lives were about to become nastier, brutish, and more short than they had been before. We, by contrast, know that hard times do lie ahead of us, but by application of knowledge, hard work, and collaboration, we can build a better future for ourselves. And that, perhaps, is the greatest advantage of 2020. Does anyone still think that 2020 was the worst year ever? Me neither. You're welcome.